The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weathered building that served as Tombstone's general store. And Sarah Preston wondered if she had made the most foolish decision of her 22 years on this earth, as she stared out at the parched Arizona Territory landscape that stretched endlessly under the merciless June sun of 1883. Dust coated everything, turning the world into shades of brown and gray, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat that made her lightweight traveling dress cling uncomfortably to her skin. She had expected the West to be different from Philadelphia, certainly, but nothing could have prepared her for the absolute dryness of this place. The way the land seemed to be gasping for moisture the same way a dying man might gasp for air. The driver opened the door and offered his weathered hand to help her down. "Welcome to Tombstone, miss. Your intended ought to be along shortly. Patrick Henderson sent word he would meet the afternoon stage." Sarah's stomach tightened with nervousness as she stepped down onto the dusty street, her shoes making small clouds of powder rise with each footfall. The few people moving about on the wooden sidewalks looked at her with open curiosity, and she felt acutely aware of how out of place she must appear with her proper Eastern clothing and the two modest carpetbags that contained everything she owned in the world. She had responded to Patrick Henderson's advertisement 3 months ago, driven by circumstances that had left her with few options after her father's death, had revealed debts that consumed everything including the small apothecary shop where she had learned about medicinal plants and natural remedies. Her mother had died when Sarah was young, and her father had raised her in that shop, teaching her everything he knew about herbs and minerals and the properties of water itself. Knowledge passed down through generations that most people dismissed as folk wisdom. A tall man approached from across the street, his hat pulled low against the sun, and Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. This would be Patrick Henderson, the rancher who needed a wife, the man whose letters had been practical rather than romantic, outlining what he could offer and what he expected in return. He was 28 according to his correspondence, a reasonable age difference, and he owned a cattle ranch 15 miles outside of town. "Miss Preston." His voice was deeper than she had imagined, rough around the edges but not unkind. He removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair and green eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was handsome in a rugged way, with sun-weathered skin and strong features that spoke of long hours working outdoors. "Mr. Henderson." She extended her hand in what she hoped was a confident gesture, though her fingers trembled slightly. "I am pleased to finally meet you in person." He shook her hand briefly, his palm calloused and warm. "The wagon is just there. We should get moving before the heat gets worse." "It is a long ride to the ranch." His directness startled her, though she supposed she should have expected it from his letters. Patrick Henderson was clearly not a man who wasted words on pleasantries. He collected her bags and strode toward a wagon hitched to 2 horses that looked as tired and dusty as everything else in this town. Sarah followed, her mind racing with questions she had not dared to ask in her letters. What would the ranch be like? Would she be able to fulfill his expectations as a wife? Would they find any common ground beyond the practical arrangement that had brought them together? The wagon ride began in silence, and Sarah focused on the landscape passing by, trying to see past the drought conditions to imagine what this country might look like in better times. The mountains in the distance held a stark beauty despite their barren appearance, and the occasional twisted mesquite tree broke up the monotony of scrub and sand. "It was not always this dry," Patrick said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. 3 years ago, we had decent rainfall. The grass was good, and the cattle were fat, but the drought has been getting worse each year. This is the worst I have seen in my 10 years here." Sarah turned to study his profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the reins. "Your letters mentioned difficulties with the ranch. I was trying to be honest." He glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "I will not lie to you about our situation. The creek that runs through my property has gone dry for the first time since my father established the ranch 20 years ago. We are hauling water from a spring 5 miles away, but it is barely enough for the household and the remaining cattle. I have already sold off half my herd because I could not keep them watered and fed." The desperation in his voice was carefully controlled, but Sarah heard it nonetheless. This was a man watching his life's work die before his eyes, and she felt a surge of sympathy despite her own uncertain position. "How many cattle remain?" she asked. "About 200 head. I need at least 400 to make the ranch profitable enough to sustain us through the year. If I lose any more, I will have to sell the land itself." He was quiet for a moment. "That is why I needed a wife who understood that this would not be easy. I cannot offer you luxury or comfort right now, just hard work and the hope that things will improve." Sarah nodded slowly, processing this information. "In your letters, you mentioned that you have ranch hands. I did have 4. Now I have 2. Miguel Reyes and Tom Whitfield. Good men, both of them, but they have families in town and cannot stay at the ranch full-time anymore because I cannot pay them properly. They come out 3 days a week to help with essential work." The situation was even more dire than his letters had suggested, and Sarah felt a flutter of panic in her chest. But she had come too far to turn back now, and besides, where would she go? She had used the last of her money for the train ticket and stagecoach fare to reach Tombstone. They drove in silence for another hour, and the heat pressed down on them like a physical weight. Sarah's throat grew parched, and she was grateful when Patrick handed her a canteen without her having to ask. The water was warm but welcome, and she drank sparingly, aware that even water must be precious in a place like this. Finally, they crested a low rise, and Sarah saw the ranch spread out below them. The main house was a single-story adobe structure that looked solid despite its weathered appearance. A barn stood nearby, along with several smaller outbuildings and a series of corrals that held far fewer cattle than they were designed to accommodate. What should have been fields of grass were instead expanses of cracked earth and dead vegetation. But it was the sight of the dry creek bed cutting through the property that truly drove home the severity of the situation. Sarah could see where water had once flowed, carving a clear path through the land, but now it was nothing more than a dusty scar lined with dying cottonwood trees. "There," Patrick said quietly, pointing toward the creek. "That is what is killing us. That creek has been the lifeblood of this ranch since the beginning. Without it, we are just slowly dying." Sarah studied the creek bed with growing interest, her father's teaching stirring in her mind. She noticed details that Patrick might have overlooked, the way the land sloped, the types of vegetation that still clung to life in certain areas, the color and texture of the soil at different points. Patrick guided the wagon down to the house and brought it to a stop in front of the entrance. Before Sarah could fully absorb her surroundings, the door opened, and a woman in her 50s stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. "This must be your bride," the woman said with a warm smile that eased some of Sarah's nervousness. "I am Clara Martinez. I keep house for Patrick and cook the meals. Welcome to the Broken Creek Ranch." "The ranch has a name?" Sarah asked as Patrick helped her down from the wagon. "My father named it that years ago, before the creek actually broke," Patrick said with a trace of bitter irony. "He thought it was because of the way the water curved. Now it seems prophetic." Clara ushered Sarah inside while Patrick dealt with the horses and luggage. The interior of the house was cooler than outside, the thick adobe walls providing insulation against the heat. The main room served as kitchen and living area combined, with a large fireplace at one end and a wooden table with chairs in the center. Simple but clean, everything in its place. "Let me show you where you will be staying," Clara said, leading Sarah down a short hallway. She opened a door to reveal a modest bedroom with a double bed covered in a faded quilt, a dresser, and a washstand. "Patrick's room is across the hall. He said you might want separate spaces until after the wedding ceremony." Sarah felt her face flush with heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. "When is the ceremony planned?" "Day after tomorrow, if that suits you. Father Miguel from town will come out to perform the service. Nothing fancy, but it will be legal and proper." Clara patted her arm kindly. "I know this must all be overwhelming, child, but Patrick is a good man. He will treat you right." After Clara left her to settle in, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment of uncertainty. Everything was happening so quickly, and the reality of her situation was sinking in with uncomfortable clarity. In 2 days, she would be married to a man she had only just met, tied to a failing ranch in the middle of a drought-stricken wilderness. But wallowing in doubt would accomplish nothing. Sarah stood and began unpacking her belongings, hanging her few dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her personal items on the dresser. Among her possessions was a worn leather journal that had belonged to her father, filled with his notes on water sources, soil conditions, and plant indicators. She had brought it on impulse, thinking it might be useful in her new life, though she had not imagined circumstances quite like these. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Preston, dinner will be ready soon," Patrick's voice called through the wood. "I will be right there," Sarah replied, smoothing her hair and trying to compose herself. Dinner was a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and dried beef, but Clara had prepared it well, and Sarah was hungry enough after the long journey to eat with genuine appreciation. Patrick sat across from her at the table, and Clara joined them, filling the silence with friendly chatter about the ranch and the area. "How long have you worked here?" Sarah asked Clara. 20 years, since Patrick's father first hired me. I was widowed young and needed work, and Samuel Henderson was kind enough to give me a position. I watched Patrick grow up here, and I stayed on after his father passed 5 years ago." Clara's eyes held affection as she glanced at Patrick. "This place has been my home for longer than anywhere else." "My father built this ranch from nothing," Patrick added, his voice carrying both pride and sadness. "He came here with a dream and made it work through sheer determination. I cannot let it die on my watch." The weight of that responsibility was evident in every line of his body, and Sarah found herself wanting to help ease his burden somehow, despite barely knowing him. After dinner, Patrick excused himself to check on the cattle, and Sarah helped Clara clean up the dishes. The older woman showed her where everything was kept and explained the household routines with patient detail. "The biggest challenge is water," Clara said as she dried a plate. "We have to haul every drop from that spring I mentioned, and it is hard work. We are careful not to waste a single bit. Laundry day comes only once every 2 weeks, and we reuse the washing water for the garden, though even that is barely keeping anything alive." Sarah nodded, her mind working through possibilities. "May I ask you something? Has anyone ever tried to find other water sources on the property?" Clara shrugged. "Patrick hired a water witch a year ago, one of those fellows who walks around with a forked stick. The man claimed to sense water in a few spots, but when Patrick dug where he indicated, there was nothing but dry earth and rock. Cost him $50 he could not afford to lose." "I see," Sarah filed that information away, thinking about what she had observed during the ride to the ranch. What about wells? Are there any on the property? There is one old well behind the barn, but it went dry 2 years ago. Patrick says the water table must have dropped below where it can be reached. That night, Sarah lay in her unfamiliar bed and listened to the sounds of her new home settling around her. The wind made a lonely sound as it swept across the parched land, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. She thought about the creek bed she had seen, about the patterns of vegetation and soil, about everything her father had taught her regarding the movement of water through earth and stone. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, Sarah dreamed of flowing water and green grass, of a land restored to life and prosperity. The next morning, she woke early to find Clara already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Patrick had apparently been up even earlier, as his breakfast dishes were already washed and set aside. "He is out checking the cattle," Clara explained. "The man barely sleeps these days, too worried about losing everything." After eating, Sarah asked, "Would it be acceptable if I walked around the property? I would like to familiarize myself with my new home." Clara smiled. "Of course, dear. Just be careful of the sun. It gets brutal by midday. Take a hat and the canteen." Sarah donned a wide-brimmed hat that Clara provided and set out with her father's journal tucked under her arm and the canteen slung over her shoulder. She walked slowly, taking in details that most people might overlook. The land told stories if you knew how to read them. She followed the dry creek bed upstream, noting how some plants along its edges still showed faint signs of green despite the drought. Cottonwood trees that should have been dead still had some life in their deeper roots. That suggested water existed somewhere below the surface, even if it was no longer flowing above ground. Sarah knelt at various points along the creek, examining the soil and rocks. In some places, the earth felt different under her hands, more dense and cool even in the heat of the morning. Her father had taught her that different types of soil retained water differently, and that certain rock formations could trap moisture underground. She was so absorbed in her observations that she did not hear Patrick approach until he spoke. "What are you doing?" Sarah straightened quickly, brushing dust from her skirt. "I was examining the creek bed. I hope that is acceptable." Patrick studied her with a puzzled expression. "Why would you examine a dry creek bed?" "My father owned an apothecary in Philadelphia, but his real passion was understanding water and plants. He learned from his grandfather, who learned from his grandfather before that. Knowledge passed down through generations." Sarah felt suddenly self-conscious under Patrick's intense gaze. "I know it might seem strange, but I thought perhaps I could learn something useful about your land. A water witch using plants instead of a stick." Patrick's tone was not quite mocking, but skeptical. "Not a water witch," Sarah said firmly. "This is observation and knowledge of natural systems. My father could read land the way some people read books. He taught me what he knew." Patrick was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah braced herself for dismissal or ridicule. But instead he said, "Show me what you see." Surprised, Sarah led him along the creek bed, pointing out the details she had noticed. "Look at these cottonwoods. They should be dead, but they are not. Their roots must be reaching water far below the surface. And here the soil has a different composition. It is more clay-like, which means it could be holding moisture that sandier soil would let drain away." She walked further upstream, with Patrick following silently. "And look at this section. Do you see how the rocks are arranged? There is a natural depression here where water would collect during rain. If water is moving underground through this area, it might be traveling along the bedrock, following the path of least resistance." Patrick knelt where she indicated, touching the rocks with his calloused hands. I have walked this creek bed 1,000 times and never noticed any of this. You were looking at what was not there anymore, Sarah said gently. I am trying to see what might still be there, hidden. They continued walking, and Sarah asked questions about the property's history. Where had the spring been that originally fed the creek? Were there any other areas where water had once been present? Had the ranch always gotten its water from this creek, or had there been other sources? Patrick answered her questions thoroughly, and Sarah began to form a picture in her mind of how water had once moved through this land. The spring that fed the creek was in the hills to the west, but Patrick said it had slowed to barely a trickle. The old well behind the barn had been dug by his father 25 years ago and had been reliable until 2 years prior. May I see the well? Sarah asked. They walked back toward the barn, and Patrick led her to a stone-lined well with a wooden cover. He removed the cover, and Sarah peered down into darkness. She dropped a pebble and listened, but heard no splash, only the sound of stone hitting stone far below. Completely dry, Patrick confirmed. I checked it last month, hoping that maybe the water table had risen with the spring rains, but there was nothing. Sarah studied the area around the well, noting the layout of the land and the types of plants that grew nearby. Even in drought conditions, certain hardy plants clustered in this area, their roots probably seeking whatever moisture they could find deep underground. Your father chose this spot for a reason, Sarah said thoughtfully. There must have been indicators that water was present here. The question is whether the water is truly gone or just deeper than the well reaches. It would cost a fortune to dig deeper. Money I do not have, Patrick said flatly, and there is no guarantee that water would be there even if I could afford it. Sarah nodded, understanding his frustration. She spent the rest of the morning walking the property, filling pages of her father's journal with observations and sketches. Patrick returned to his work, but Sarah noticed him watching her from a distance several times, his expression unreadable. By midday, the heat drove Sarah back to the house, where Clara had a cold lunch waiting. As she ate, Sarah studied her notes, patterns beginning to emerge in her mind. You look like a scholar poring over important documents, Clara said with amusement. Just trying to understand how water moves through this land, Sarah replied. Or how it used to move anyway. That afternoon, while Patrick was occupied with ranch work, Sarah borrowed a shovel from the barn and walked to a spot she had marked in her journal. It was about 50 yards from the old well, in an area where certain plants seemed healthier than elsewhere. She began to dig, working slowly in the heat, removing earth one shovelful at a time. She had dug down about 3 feet when the soil changed character, becoming darker and slightly damp. Her heart quickened with excitement, and she kept digging, going down another foot before she hit a layer of dense clay. She reached down and scooped up a handful of the clay, squeezing it. Water seeped between her fingers, not much, but unmistakably present. What in the name of heaven are you doing? Sarah looked up to find Patrick staring down at her, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. She was standing in a hole up to her waist, covered in dirt, her dress ruined, and her face flushed with exertion and triumph. I found water, she said breathlessly, holding up her muddy hand. It is not much, but it is here. The water table has not disappeared entirely. It has just dropped lower than anyone realized. Patrick jumped down into the hole beside her, his boots making the space suddenly cramped. He knelt and felt the damp clay himself, his eyes widening. This is 4 feet down. The well is 30 feet deep. How could there be moisture here at 4 feet when the well is bone dry? Because water does not always move uniformly through the ground, Sarah explained, her excitement making words tumble out quickly. It follows channels through permeable rock and soil. This clay layer is probably catching and holding water that is moving horizontally through the ground, coming from somewhere higher up. The well might be in a spot where the water channels do not pass through, or it might be that the rock formation at the bottom of the well is impermeable. Patrick stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You learned all this from your father." He was passionate about it. "He used to take me on trips outside the city to study springs and streams, showing me how to read the land. People thought he was eccentric, but his knowledge was real." Sarah felt suddenly shy under Patrick's intense gaze. "I know it might not seem like much, finding damp clay, but it tells us that water is still present underground. We just need to find where it is most accessible." Patrick helped her climb out of the hole, his strong hands gripping hers firmly. When they stood facing each other on solid ground, he did not immediately let go. "Sarah Preston, you are not what I expected when I placed that advertisement." "I hope that is not a bad thing," she said quietly. "No," he said, his green eyes holding hers. "It is not a bad thing at all." That evening, over dinner, Sarah spread out her journal on the table and explained her observations to both Patrick and Clara. She pointed out the patterns she had noticed, the places where plant life suggested underground water, and the geological features that might indicate water movement. "There are 3 spots I think are worth investigating further," she said, marking them on a rough sketch of the property. "One is about 100 yards upstream from the old well. Another is at the bend in the dry creek, where the cottonwoods are still partially alive. And the third is near the base of the hills on the western edge of your property, where I noticed seep willows growing." "Seep willows?" Patrick asked. "They are a type of plant that only grows where there is underground water close to the surface. If they are alive, even struggling, it means water is there." Sarah looked between Patrick and Clara, hoping they would not think her foolish. "I cannot guarantee we will find enough water to save the ranch. But I believe there is water present, and I think we have a chance of accessing it if we are smart about where we dig." Patrick was quiet for a long time, studying her sketches. Finally, he said, "Tomorrow is our wedding day. The day after, we will start digging where you suggest. If you are wrong, we will have wasted time and energy we can barely spare. But if you are right—" He trailed off, hope flickering in his expression for the first time since Sarah had met him. "If I am right, we might be able to save your ranch," Sarah finished softly. The next morning dawned clear and hot, as every day seemed to in this parched land. Sarah dressed carefully in her best gown, a simple but elegant dress in soft blue that she had worn to church back in Philadelphia. Her hands trembled as she fastened the buttons, the reality of what she was about to do settling over her like a weight. She was marrying a man she barely knew, committing her life to his in a ceremony that would bind them together legally and morally. It was what she had agreed to when she answered his advertisement, but the reality was far more daunting than the abstract idea had been. Clara helped her arrange her hair, weaving in a few wildflowers that the older woman had somehow managed to keep alive in pots near the house. "You look beautiful," Clara said warmly. "Patrick is a lucky man." "I hope he thinks so after today," Sarah said nervously. "He does. I can see it in the way he looks at you." Clara smiled. "I know this is not a traditional courtship or romance, but that does not mean it cannot become something real and good in time." Father Miguel arrived at mid-morning, a kindly older priest who had made the journey from Tombstone in his own wagon. With him came Tom Whitfield and Miguel Reyes, the 2 ranch hands who Patrick had mentioned, along with their wives. They would serve as witnesses to the ceremony. Patrick waited in the main room, dressed in clean clothes that Sarah suspected he did not wear often, his hair neatly combed and his expression serious. When Sarah entered, his eyes widened slightly, and something warm flickered in their green depths. The ceremony was brief and simple, Father Miguel's words carrying the weight of tradition and solemnity. Sarah repeated her vows in a voice that barely shook, promising to honor and cherish this man who was now her husband. Patrick's voice was steady and firm as he made his own promises, and when he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Sarah felt the full impact of the commitment she had made. "You may kiss your bride," Father Miguel said with a gentle smile. Patrick hesitated only a moment before cupping Sarah's face in his rough hands and pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was chaste but sent warmth flooding through her body. When he pulled back, his eyes held a question, and Sarah found herself smiling despite her nervousness. They were married. For better or worse, Sarah Preston was now Sarah Henderson, wife to a rancher in the Arizona Territory, tied to the fate of Broken Creek Ranch and the man who fought so desperately to save it. The small group celebrated with a meal that Clara and the ranch hands' wives had prepared, making the most of limited resources. There was laughter and conversation, and Sarah felt herself beginning to relax as Tom and Miguel told stories about the ranch in better times. "I remember when this place was green as Ireland," Tom said, his weathered face creasing with the memory. "Cattle as far as you could see, fat and happy. Water flowing in that creek strong enough for a man to take a bath in." "We will see those days again," Patrick said firmly. "My wife seems to think she can find water, and I am willing to try anything at this point." "Your wife?" Miguel grinned. "Still getting used to saying that, are you?" Patrick's eyes found Sarah across the table, and the look he gave her made her breath catch. "Yes, my wife." After the guests departed, the reality of their wedding night loomed between Sarah and Patrick with awkward weight. They stood in the main room as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, neither quite sure how to proceed. "I know this is not how most marriages begin," Patrick said finally. "If you need time before that is, I will not force you into anything you are not ready for." Sarah appreciated his consideration, even as her own feelings tangled into confusion. She was attracted to Patrick, drawn to his strength and determination, but she barely knew him. Yet they were married now, and she was practical enough to understand what that meant. "I appreciate your kindness," she said softly. "Perhaps we could take things slowly, get to know each other better." Relief and something that might have been disappointment flickered across Patrick's face. "Of course, there is no rush. We have the rest of our lives, God willing." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Patrick said, "Tell me more about your father. About your life in Philadelphia." They sat at the table, and Sarah found herself talking about her childhood in the apothecary, about learning to identify herbs and mix remedies, about her father's passion for understanding the natural world. Patrick listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest. In turn, he told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father's dreams and struggles, about watching the land change over the years. His love for this place came through in every word, and Sarah understood why he fought so hard to keep it. When they finally retired to their separate rooms, Sarah felt that they had taken a small but important step toward building something real between them. Marriage was more than physical union. It was partnership and understanding, and those things took time to develop. The next morning, Patrick, Tom, Miguel, and Sarah set out early to the first location she had marked. The spot was upstream from the old well, in an area where Sarah had noticed a slight depression in the land and a concentration of hardy plants. "We will dig here," she said, marking the spot with a stick. The men took turns with shovels while Sarah watched carefully, directing them to expand the hole in certain directions based on what the soil revealed. By midday, They had gone down 6 feet and found the same dense clay layer Sarah had discovered the day before, but the moisture content seemed higher. "Keep going," Sarah urged. "I think we are close to something." Another 2 feet down, and suddenly the clay gave way to gravel. Tom's shovel sank deeper than expected, and when he pulled it out, water seeped into the hole. Not a lot, but unmistakably present, filling the space slowly but steadily. "We hit it," Miguel exclaimed. "There is water here." They watched as the hole filled inch by inch over the next hour, settling at about 2 feet deep before it stopped rising. Patrick knelt at the edge, staring at the water with an expression Sarah could not quite read. "It is not much," he said finally. "Not yet," Sarah agreed. "But this tells us we have found a water-bearing layer. We need to dig wider and deeper and possibly shore up the sides to create a proper catch basin. This could supplement the water you haul from the spring." "Or it could be a waste of time and effort," Patrick said, but his tone lacked conviction. Hope was a dangerous thing for a man in his position, but Sarah could see it kindling in his eyes despite his caution. They spent the rest of the day expanding the hole and reinforcing the sides with stones from a nearby outcrop. By evening, they had created a basin about 8 feet across and 10 feet deep, and water had filled it to a depth of 3 feet. Patrick tested the water, finding it clear and cool. "It is good water, not alkali or bitter." "The clay probably filters it," Sarah said. "This is a natural spring just buried deeper than your well could reach." They returned to the house exhausted but cautiously optimistic. Over the next week, Patrick and the ranch hands worked to develop the spring further, digging channels to direct more water into the basin and building a proper wall around it. The water level rose to 4 feet and held steady there. It was not enough to supply the whole ranch, but it was something. The cattle could be brought to drink in shifts, and the household no longer had to haul every drop from the distant spring. Sarah watched Patrick's entire demeanor change as the days passed. The tension that had made his shoulders rigid began to ease, and he smiled more often. At night, they continued their practice of sitting together and talking, learning about each other in small increments. One evening, about 2 weeks after their wedding, Patrick reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "You have given me something I thought I had lost," he said quietly. "Hope, not just for the ranch but for the future." Sarah's heart fluttered at his touch and the warmth in his eyes. "I have only done what I know how to do. You have done more than that." Patrick's thumb traced circles on her palm. "You came here expecting one thing and found something much harder. You could have complained or demanded to be sent back east. Instead, you rolled up your sleeves and started digging in the dirt. You are remarkable, Sarah Henderson." The use of her married name sent a thrill through Sarah. "I have nowhere else to go," she said honestly. "And more than that, I want to see this place thrive. I want to help you save what your father built." "It is not just about my father anymore," Patrick said, his green eyes intense. "It is about us, about building a life together." That night, when they parted for their separate rooms, Patrick kissed her again, longer and deeper than at their wedding, and Sarah felt the restraint they had both been exercising begin to crack. She went to bed with her heart racing and her body alive with new sensations. But there was still work to be done. The single spring they had uncovered was helping, but it was not enough to truly save the ranch. Sarah continued her explorations of the property, and 2 days later, she announced that she wanted to investigate the dry creek bed more thoroughly. "I keep coming back to those cottonwoods," she said at breakfast. "They are the largest trees on the property, and they must have roots going very deep to still be alive. If we dig near them, we might find the main underground channel that used to feed the creek." Patrick agreed, and the following morning they began excavating at the base of the largest cottonwood, a gnarled giant with bark like weathered stone. The tree stood at a bend in the dry creek, its massive roots visible where erosion had exposed them. Digging near the tree was difficult because of the roots, but Sarah directed them to work around the largest ones, following the natural gaps. They went down 8 feet before hitting bedrock, and Sarah's heart sank, thinking they had failed. But Patrick insisted on digging a bit further along, following the bedrock at an angle. Suddenly, his shovel broke through into a void, and they heard the unmistakable sound of running water. "There is something down here," Patrick exclaimed, excitement raising his voice. "Help me clear this." They worked frantically, expanding the opening and revealed a fissure in the bedrock about 2 feet wide. Water flowed through it, not a huge amount but steady and clear, moving from west to east beneath the surface. "This is it," Sarah breathed. "This is the original source that fed your creek." It is still flowing underground, following the bedrock layer. The drought must have caused the surface channel to dry up, but the underground flow continued. "Can we bring it back to the surface?" Tom asked. Sarah studied the situation carefully. "We would need to create a new channel, digging deep enough to intercept this underground flow and direct it where we want it to go. It would be a lot of work." "We have got nothing but time and desperation," Patrick said. "Tell us what to do." Over the next month, the 4 of them worked like people possessed, digging a channel from the underground stream toward the area where the cattle grazed. Sarah designed the system based on principles her father had taught her, using gravity and careful grading to ensure the water would flow efficiently. Clara brought lunch to them in the field each day, marveling at the progress. "I never thought I would see water flowing on this land again," she said, tears in her eyes. The work was backbreaking and there were setbacks. Twice, sections of their channel collapsed and had to be rebuilt. Once, they hit a layer of rock that required them to redirect the entire flow at a different angle. But slowly, surely, they created a new creek bed that brought water from the underground source to the surface. The day water first flowed along the entire length of their new channel, Patrick whooped with joy and grabbed Sarah, spinning her around in a circle before kissing her soundly in front of everyone. Sarah laughed breathlessly, dizzy from the spinning and the kiss and the sheer triumph of what they had accomplished. "We did it," Patrick said, his forehead pressed to hers. "We actually did it." "We are not done yet," Sarah said, but she was smiling. "We need to shore up the banks and create pools where the cattle can drink and plant vegetation along the sides to prevent erosion." "Always thinking ahead," Patrick said fondly. "That is why I am falling in love with you, Sarah Henderson." The words hung in the air between them and Sarah's breath caught. Patrick looked almost surprised that he had said it out loud, but he did not take it back. Instead, he waited, vulnerable in a way she had never seen him before. "I am falling in love with you too," Sarah said softly. "With your determination and your devotion to this place. With the way you listen to my ideas even when they must sound crazy. With your kindness to Clara and your fairness to your ranch hands." Patrick kissed her again, slower this time, a kiss full of promise. That night, for the first time, Sarah did not retire to her separate room. Instead, she went with Patrick to his, and they consummated their marriage with a passion born of growing love and mutual respect. As summer turned to autumn, the ranch began to transform. The new creek brought life back to the land, and grass started growing along its banks. Patrick was able to move his cattle to better grazing, and the animals quickly regained the weight they had lost during the drought. Sarah continued to apply her knowledge, identifying areas where they could plant crops that would thrive with the available water. She created a system of small irrigation channels that brought water to a vegetable garden near the house, providing fresh food for the household. Word of their success spread, and neighbors began arriving to see the miracle for themselves. Some sought Sarah's advice about their own water problems, and she shared what she knew freely, understanding that everyone in the territory was struggling. One visitor was a man named Robert Sullivan, who owned the ranch adjacent to Patrick's property. He was a large man with a booming voice and a friendly demeanor, but Sarah noticed the desperate edge to his questions about water. "My creek dried up just like yours," Sullivan said. "I've been hauling water for 2 years now, watching my herd shrink. If you could take a look at my land, tell me if you see what you saw here. I would be forever grateful." Sarah glanced at Patrick, who nodded. "We would be happy to help," she said. They spent a day walking Sullivan's property, and Sarah identified 2 likely spots for digging. "I cannot promise you will find water," she cautioned. "Every piece of land is different, but these areas show the same indicators I saw on our ranch." Sullivan thanked them profusely and began digging the very next day. Within a week, he sent word that he had found water at the second location Sarah had marked, and his gratitude came in the form of 3 good breeding bulls he offered to Patrick at a fraction of their value. "Your wife is going to make us wealthy if she keeps this up," Sullivan joked, "or at least less poor." With the water situation stabilizing, Patrick began rebuilding his herd. He used the money from selling wool from the ranch's small flock of sheep to purchase additional cattle. And Miguel's brother-in-law came on, as another ranch hand now that Patrick could afford to pay proper wages again. By Christmas, the Broken Creek Ranch was operating at a level Patrick had not seen in 3 years. The creek still flowed steadily, though it was not as robust as in the years before the drought began. But it was enough, and Sarah had plans for developing additional water sources in the spring. On Christmas Eve, Clara prepared a feast with vegetables from Sarah's garden and a pig that Tom had helped butcher. Patrick invited the ranch hands and their families to celebrate, and the house was filled with laughter and warmth. That night, as Sarah and Patrick lay together in their bed, he said, "I have something for you." He produced a small wooden box and opened it to reveal a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a water droplet. "I had this made in Tombstone." The jeweler thought I was crazy, but I tried to explain what water means to us. "What you mean to me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as Patrick fastened the necklace around her neck. "It is beautiful. I love you, Sarah. Not because you saved my ranch, though I am grateful for that beyond measure. I love you because of who you are, the way your mind works, your strength and your kindness." Patrick kissed her forehead gently. "I know we did not start this marriage in the traditional way, but I cannot imagine my life without you now." "I love you too," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "When I came here, I was running from loss and debt and uncertainty. I thought I was giving up on dreams of romance and love, settling for mere survival. But I found something more real and true than I ever imagined possible. I found a partner, a purpose, and a home." As winter gave way to spring, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She told Patrick one evening as they walked along their creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "We are going to have a baby," she said simply, taking his hand and placing it on her belly. Patrick's face went through a range of emotions: surprise, joy, fear, wonder, settling finally on pure happiness. "A baby. Sarah, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. I estimate the baby will arrive in late August or early September." Patrick swept her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she were suddenly made of glass. "This is the best news, a child, our child." "Are you ready to be a father?" Sarah asked, searching his face. "I am terrified," Patrick admitted honestly, "but I am ready. We will figure it out together, just like we have figured out everything else." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Sarah continued her work on the ranch, though Patrick and Clara both insisted she take things easier as her belly grew. She spent time planning improvements to the water system and teaching Patrick everything her father had taught her, wanting to ensure the knowledge would continue. In August, as Sarah's due date approached, Patrick insisted on bringing a midwife named Mrs. Fletcher out from Tombstone to stay at the ranch. The woman was experienced and calm, and her presence eased both Sarah's and Patrick's nervousness. On a warm afternoon in early September, Sarah went into labor. Patrick paced outside their bedroom like a caged animal while Clara and Mrs. Fletcher attended to his wife. The sounds of Sarah's pain nearly drove him mad with helplessness, but Clara periodically emerged to assure him that everything was progressing normally. After 8 hours of labor, as the sun was setting, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When Patrick was finally allowed into the room, he found Sarah exhausted but radiant, holding their son wrapped in a soft blanket. "Meet your son," Sarah said softly, her eyes shining with tears and joy. Patrick approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny red face of his child. The baby's eyes were closed and his little fists waved aimlessly. Patrick felt his heart expand with a love so fierce and immediate that it took his breath away. "He is perfect," Patrick whispered. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Samuel, after your father," Sarah said. "If that is acceptable to you." Patrick's eyes filled with tears. "My father would have been honored. Samuel Henderson. Welcome to the world, son." Little Samuel was a good baby, healthy and strong. He nursed well and slept in reasonable patterns, and both Patrick and Sarah fell completely in love with him. Patrick proved to be a devoted father, helping with nighttime feedings and changing diapers without complaint. As Samuel grew, the ranch continued to prosper. The creek flowed reliably, fed by the underground source Sarah had discovered. Patrick expanded his herd to 400 head and then to 600. He purchased more land from a neighbor who decided to leave the territory, adding another 2,000 acres to the ranch. Sarah developed additional water sources, including 2 more springs, and a sophisticated irrigation system that allowed them to grow hay and alfalfa to supplement the grazing. She became known throughout the territory as an expert on water finding, and people traveled from as far as Tucson to seek her advice. When Samuel was 2 years old, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, after Sarah's mother. Emma had her mother's determination and her father's green eyes, and she brought new joy to the household. Clara remained with them, serving now less as a housekeeper and more as a beloved grandmother to the children. She taught Emma to cook and helped Sarah preserve vegetables from the ever-expanding garden. Patrick hired additional ranch hands as the operation grew, and he became known as a fair and generous employer. Tom Whitfield and Miguel Reyes remained his closest associates, and their families intertwined with the Hendersons through years of shared work and celebration. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Patrick took Sarah on a picnic to the spot where she had first found water on the ranch. The original spring had been developed into a proper well with a windmill to pump water into storage tanks. "You remember the day I found you digging in a hole, covered in mud?" Patrick asked, spreading a blanket on the ground. "I remember thinking you probably regretted your mail-order bride who seemed more interested in dirt than in cooking dinner," Sarah said with a laugh. "I thought you were magnificent," Patrick said seriously. "I had been so focused on what I was losing that I could not see possibilities anymore. But you looked at this dry, dying land and saw hope. You saw potential. You saw what could be instead of what was." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in the way of long marriage. "I saw a man worth fighting for and a place worth saving. "You saved more than the ranch," Patrick said. "You saved me. I was drowning in despair, and you threw me a lifeline." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Samuel and Emma play near the creek that now ran year-round. The children were catching tadpoles in a shallow pool, their laughter floating on the breeze. "I want to tell you something," Sarah said. "I am pregnant again." Patrick's face lit up with joy. "Another child, Sarah, that is wonderful. When? Spring, I think. Maybe March or April." Patrick kissed her tenderly. "Our family keeps growing just like the ranch. We are truly blessed." The third child, another son they named Daniel, arrived in April during a rainstorm that broke a month-long dry spell. Patrick took it as a good omen. And indeed, that year brought excellent rainfall and the best grass anyone could remember in a decade. The Broken Creek Ranch became one of the most successful operations in the territory. Patrick's cattle were known for their quality, and he began breeding stock to sell to other ranchers. Sarah's water expertise led to consulting work that brought in additional income, and she saved every dollar toward ensuring their children's future. They built a new house, larger and more comfortable than the original adobe structure, though they kept the old house for ranch hands to use. The new home had indoor plumbing, a luxury made possible by Sarah's water systems, and multiple bedrooms for their growing family. As the children grew, Patrick and Sarah taught them everything they knew about ranching and water management. Samuel showed a natural aptitude for working with cattle and horses, while Emma was fascinated by her mother's knowledge of plants and irrigation. Daniel was still too young to show his preferences, but he followed his older siblings everywhere, determined to keep up. On their 10th anniversary, the ranch hands and neighbors organized a celebration at the ranch. Nearly 100 people attended, testament to how well-liked Patrick and Sarah had become in the community. There was dancing and food and speeches honoring the couple who had turned a dying ranch into a thriving enterprise. Robert Sullivan, whose own ranch had prospered after Sarah helped him find water, raised a toast. 10 years ago, Patrick Henderson was about ready to lose everything. Then he got the smartest mail-order bride in the history of the West, and look at him now. To Patrick and Sarah Henderson, may they have another 50 years of happiness and success. The crowd cheered and drank, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach a decade ago, uncertain and alone in a harsh new world. She could never have imagined then how much her life would change, how much love and purpose she would find in this dry land. Patrick pulled her close and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for taking a chance on a desperate rancher with a dying dream. Thank you for seeing me as more than just a solution to a problem," Sarah whispered back. "Thank you for building a real marriage with me, for loving me." "Always," Patrick promised. "For the rest of our lives and beyond." As the party continued around them, they slipped away to watch the sunset from their favorite spot overlooking the creek. The water flowed steadily, catching the golden light, and in the distance, they could see their cattle grazing on lush grass. "You ever regret leaving Philadelphia?" Patrick asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I regret nothing about my father or the time I had with him. But leaving? No, this is where I was meant to be. With you, building this life, raising our children, this is home. I cannot imagine what my life would have been without you," Patrick said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Henderson. My partner, my love, the mother of my children, the savior of my ranch. And you are my heart," Sarah said simply. "The man who gave me a place to belong and a purpose to fulfill. I love you, Patrick." They stood together as the sun set over the Arizona territory. Two people who had found each other through desperate circumstances and built something beautiful and lasting. The Broken Creek Ranch would continue to thrive for generations, but more importantly, the love between Patrick and Sarah would endure, a testament to the power of partnership, perseverance, and faith in each other. Years continued to pass, and the Henderson family grew in prosperity and happiness. Samuel married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, bringing new energy and ideas to the ranch operation. Emma surprised everyone by deciding to attend a women's college in California, where she studied botany and agricultural science before returning to help her mother develop even more sophisticated irrigation systems. Daniel proved to have a gift for business, and he eventually took over the financial management of the ranch, expanding their operations to include a slaughterhouse in Tombstone and contracts to supply beef to the Army forts scattered throughout the territory. Patrick and Sarah grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. Their hair turned gray, and their faces lined with age, but the bond between them remained as strong as ever. They became grandparents many times over, and their home was always filled with the laughter of children and the warmth of family. On their 30th anniversary, Sarah and Patrick returned to the spot where they had first found water together. The original excavation had long since been properly developed into a formal well, but they still called it Sarah's Spring, and it had never run dry. 30 years, Patrick marveled. It seems like yesterday that you stepped off that stagecoach, looking so proper and nervous. You looked terrified, Sarah teased. I think you expected someone who would faint at the sight of dust. Instead, I got someone who jumped into holes and dug in the mud looking for water. Patrick laughed. Best surprise of my life. Sarah took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. We have had a good life, haven't we? The best, Patrick agreed. 3 wonderful children, 8 grandchildren so far, a ranch that is known throughout the territory. But more than that, we have had each other. That is what I treasure most. I love you, Sarah said. I have loved you for so long now that I can hardly remember what it felt like not to love you. I love you too, Patrick said. You are my partner in every sense of the word. We built this life together, and it has been more than I ever dreamed possible. They sat together in the shade of the old cottonwood tree, the same tree that had led Sarah to discover the underground stream that saved the ranch. The tree was even larger now, its branches spreading wide, and it had become a landmark on the property. Their grandchildren played nearby, wading in the creek and catching minnows, just as their own children had done years before. The sound of their laughter and splashing was the sweetest music Sarah had ever heard. This is what matters, Sarah said softly. Family and love and a place to call home. Everything else is just details. Wise words from my wise wife, Patrick said, kissing her temple gently. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, they gathered their grandchildren and walked back toward the house. Clara had passed away peacefully 5 years earlier, but her legacy lived on in the family she had helped raise and the traditions she had established. The house glowed with lamplight as they approached, and Sarah could see their children and their spouses preparing dinner. The table would be crowded tonight, filled with multiple generations of Hendersons, all of them thriving on this ranch that had nearly died 30 years ago. Patrick squeezed Sarah's hand as they climbed the porch steps. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? Sarah asked, though she knew. For everything. For saving the ranch, for building this life with me, for loving me even when I was too stubborn or proud to make it easy. For being exactly who you are. You make it easy to love you, Sarah said. You always have. That night, after dinner and after the extended family had departed, Sarah and Patrick sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. The night was cool, a relief after the heat of the day, and the sound of the creek provided a soothing backdrop. "You think about the future?" Sarah asked. "About what will happen to all of this when we are gone?" "Sometimes," Patrick admitted, "but I have faith in our children. They know what this land means, what it took to save it and build it into what it is today. They will carry on, and they will teach their children the same lessons we taught them." "The importance of water," Sarah said with a slight smile. "Hard work, family, love." "Exactly." Patrick pulled her closer. "Our legacy is not just the ranch itself, but the values we instilled in our children and grandchildren. That matters more than acreage or cattle or money in the bank." Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, contentment washing over her. She thought about the desperate young woman she had been, answering an advertisement from a stranger because she had nowhere else to turn. That woman could never have imagined the richness of the life that awaited her in this harsh, beautiful land. She had found purpose in saving the ranch, but she had found her true self in the love she shared with Patrick. Together, they had built something that would outlast them both, a family and a legacy rooted in the land they had worked so hard to nurture and preserve. Years continued their steady march, and eventually, Patrick and Sarah celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch was now in its second generation of Henderson management, with Samuel taking over the day-to-day operations while his father served in an advisory role. Sarah was now 72, and Patrick was 78. Both had slowed down considerably, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work and desert living. But their minds remained sharp, and their love for each other had only deepened with time. On the night of their golden anniversary, after the celebration had ended and everyone had gone home or to bed, Sarah and Patrick took one final walk to their special place by the creek. The moon was full, casting silver light across the water, and the sound of the flowing creek was peaceful in the quiet night. 50 years, Sarah said wonderingly. Half a century together. "The best 50 years of my life," Patrick said. "You gave me everything, Sarah. A family, a future, hope when I had none. You saved more than just the ranch that day you arrived in Tombstone. You saved me. And you gave me a home," Sarah said softly. "A place to belong and a love to cherish. We saved each other, Patrick." They stood together by the water, remembering all the years that had passed, all the challenges they had faced and overcome together. The drought that had brought them together seemed like ancient history now, though its lessons remained relevant. The land was never completely tame, and water was always precious in this desert territory. "I want you to know," Patrick said quietly, "that if I had my life to live over, I would not change a single thing. Every moment with you has been a gift. Even when I made you dig all those holes looking for water," Sarah teased gently. "Especially then," Patrick said with a laugh. "That was when I started falling in love with you, watching you covered in mud, absolutely certain you could save my ranch against all logic and reason." "I was terrified I was wrong," Sarah admitted, "but I had to try, for you." "You succeeded beyond anything I could have imagined," Patrick said. "Look at what we built together. A thriving ranch, a wonderful family, a life rich in love and purpose." Sarah leaned against him, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the moonlight dance on the water. The creek that had been dry when she arrived was now a permanent feature of the landscape, fed by the underground sources she had discovered and the careful water management system she had implemented. "I am tired," Sarah said after a while. "Let us go home." "Home," Patrick echoed. The most beautiful word in any language. They walked slowly back to the house, their steps measured but steady. Inside, they prepared for bed with the familiar routine of long marriage, each knowing the other's needs and preferences without words. As they lay together in the darkness, Sarah said, "I love you, Patrick Henderson. I have loved you for 50 years, and I will love you for whatever time we have left." "And I love you, Sarah Henderson," Patrick replied. "My beautiful, brilliant, extraordinary wife. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had done for thousands of nights before, secure in the knowledge that their love had created something that would endure long after they were gone. Patrick passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, at the age of 80. Sarah held his hand as he slipped away, whispering words of love and gratitude for the life they had shared. The loss was devastating, but she took comfort in knowing that they had been blessed with 52 years of marriage, far more than many people ever received. Sarah lived another 3 years after Patrick's death, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, teaching them the last of her knowledge about water and land management. She never remarried, content with the love she had known and the memories she cherished. When Sarah died at 77, surrounded by her family, her last words were, "Tell Patrick I am coming home to him." She was buried beside Patrick on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the shade of a cottonwood tree they had planted together on their 10th anniversary. The marker on their shared grave read, "Patrick and Sarah Henderson, partners in love and life, builders of dreams, forever together." The Broken Creek Ranch continued to thrive for generations, always remaining in the Henderson family. Sarah's water management systems were maintained and updated, ensuring that the ranch always had adequate water even during dry years. Her knowledge was passed down through the family, each generation learning the lessons she had taught about reading the land and working with nature rather than against it. In the town of Tombstone, a small plaque was eventually placed in the Historical Society Museum, commemorating Sarah Henderson as the woman who brought water to the desert. But her true legacy was not in public recognition. It was in the family she had raised, the land she had helped restore, and the enduring love story she had shared with Patrick. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived on the ranch more than a century later, working the land and managing the water with the same care and knowledge that Sarah had brought with her when she stepped off that stagecoach as a mail-order bride so long ago. The creek still flowed, fed by the underground sources she had discovered, a testament to her insight and determination. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Arizona desert and the water flowed peacefully through the ranch, those who knew the story liked to imagine that Patrick and Sarah were still there somehow, walking hand in hand along the creek they had brought back to life, their love as eternal as the water that sustained the land they had both called home. The story of the mail-order bride who arrived during a drought, whose knowledge of water saved the ranch and won the heart of a desperate rancher, became a cherished part of family history, told and retold to each new generation. It was a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most unlikely circumstances, and that love can bloom even in the driest of deserts when two people are willing to work together and believe in each other. Patrick and Sarah Henderson had built more than just a successful ranch. They had created a legacy of love, partnership, and perseverance that would inspire their descendants for generations to come, proving that the most valuable resource in any land is not water or cattle or gold, but the strength of human connection and the power of two hearts joined in common purpose and genuine love.